My children haven't eaten for 3 days. I will be yours forever if you feed them. Begged the blue-skinned alien woman to. The human man, Cal's hand remained on his holstered knife as he stood in the doorway of his outpost. The alien woman before him wavered on her feet, her blue skin dulled with dust and fatigue. Behind her, 2 small figures huddled together against the bitter wind that swept across the barren plains of Helios. 9, her words hung in the air between them, a desperate offering that made his jaw clench. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking, they won't survive another night out here. 3 years Cal had spent on this forsaken rock, manning this forgotten listening post at the edge of colonial space. 3 years without seeing another human face. 3 years trying to forget the screams of his squad as they were overrun during the city uprising. 3 years of nightmares of waking drenched in sweat, reaching for a weapon to fight enemies long dead. His superiors had called it a strategic reassignment. Everyone else called it exile. Now this, a blue-skinned Assyrian woman with 2 half-starved children standing at his door like some cosmic joke. Shocks took everything, she continued, her luminescent eyes reflecting the harsh lights of his outpost. We've been running for days. Kyle knew about the shock rolls. Everyone on the frontier did. Vicious raiders who preyed on weaker species, taking slaves and resources. He'd seen the aftermath of their attacks during his military service. Entire settlements reduced to smoking ruins. Survivors with vacant eyes and mutilated bodies. They didn't just kill, they broke. The smaller child coughed violently, the sound rattling in the thin atmosphere. Something in Cal's chest tightened, a feeling he had thought buried beneath layers of scar tissue, both physical and emotional. Get inside, he said, gruffly, stepping back from the doorway. But any trouble and you're back out. There, understood. Relief washed over the woman's face as she ushered the children inside. Thank you, my name is Era. These are my children, Siren and Lee. Kyle sealed the airlock behind them, the mechanical hum of the pressure system filling the silence. He watched as the woman, Elra, gently guided her children to sit on a bench near the heating unit. The boy, who looked about 11, kept his arm protectively around his younger sister, his eyes the same luminescent blue as his mother, surveyed the room with wary intelligence beyond his years. The girl, perhaps 6 or 7, leaned heavily against her brother, her breathing labored, each inhalation a visible struggle. Wait here, Kyle said, moving to the storage compartment. He returned with 3 ration packs and a canteen of water. Not exactly a feast, but it was what he had. The children tore into the food with a hunger that made Kyle look away. He'd seen starvation before, during the border conflicts. It never got easier to witness. You said shocks are after you, he said to Era, keeping his voice low. Why? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her children. It's complicated. It always is, Kyle replied, but if they tracked you here, I need to know what I'm dealing with. Era's shoulders slumped. My people, the Assyrians, have been enslaved by the shocks for generations. We worked their minds' power. Their ships, my children and I escaped from a labor camp 3 weeks ago, and they followed you across half the sector for 3 escaped slaves, Kyle asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Not just for us, she admitted, for what we represent. My son Siren, he's special. The elders believe he's the one who can Lead our people to freedom, Kale. Snorted, he's a kid, he's more than. That insisted, he's hope, the proximity. Alarm blared suddenly, cutting through their conversation. Cal moved swiftly to the monitoring station, flicking on the thermal imaging display. Red heat. Signatures moved across the screen, at least 5 figures approaching from the north. They found us, whispered her voice tight with fear. Kyle's mind raced through options, none of them good. His outpost wasn't built for defense, just surveillance. The nearest colonial patrol was at least 2 days away, and his communications array had been damaged. The last electrical storm. Take the children to the back room, he ordered. Reaching for his rifle, lock the door. And don't come out until I call for you. You can't fight them alone, Elra protested. I'm not planning to fight them, Kyle said, checking the charge on his weapon. Just discourage them. As Elra hurried the children away, Cal dimmed the outpost lights and positioned himself by the east-facing window. Through the reinforced glass he could make out hulking figures moving through the twilight shocks, their gray, scaly skin blended with the rocks, but their yellow eyes caught what little light remained in the day. Cal steadied his breathing, falling back on his military training. The lead shock roll approached the outpost perimeter, its massive form towering nearly 7 ft tall. A wickedly curved blade hung at its side. Even from this distance, Kale could see the row of small blue objects hanging from the creature's belt. Fingers, he realized with disgust, Azerian fingers taken as trophies. The proximity sensor beeped again as the creatures breached the outer marker. Kyle aimed and fired 3 quick shots. The first struck the ground at the lead shock's feet, sending up a spray of dust. The second and third bracketed the group. Clear warnings. The shock rolls halted, their guttural language carrying through the thin air. As they conferred, the leader raised a clawed hand pointing toward the outpost before making a slashing motion. Then, surprisingly, they retreated, melting back into the gathering darkness. Cal remained vigilant for another hour before finally lowering his weapon. They hadn't left, he was certain of that. They were regrouping, probably calling for reinforcements. This was just the beginning. He found Lyra and the children huddled together in the storage room, the young girl trembling in her mother's arms. Siren stood at the door, a makeshift weapon fashioned from a broken pipe clutched in his small hands. The determination in the boy's eyes reminded Kale of soldiers he had known, men and women who had seen too much, too young. They're gone for now, he said. But they'll be back. I'm sorry, Era whispered. We've brought this danger to your door. Kyle ran a hand through his short graying hair. You need to tell me everything, no more half-truths. What exactly are the shocks after? Looked down at her son, who sat quietly on a storage crate. Siren is the first child born of our bloodline in a century who carries the old gifts. He can activate the ancient technologies of our people, technologies the shocks want to weaponize. How did you escape the labor camp? Kyle asked, his tactical mind needing details. His eyes clouded with painful memories. There was a power failure during a storm. The containment fields went down for just minutes. The elders, they sacrificed themselves, creating a diversion so we could slip away. Her voice caught. 17 died so we could escape. I still hear their screams in my dreams. Siren turned away, his small shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion. It was my fault, he said, Softly, they died because of me. No, said firmly, crossing to her son and kneeling before him. They died because they believed in a future where our people are free. You are that future. Siren, the boy nodded, but Cale could see the weight of responsibility crushing down on those young shoulders. He knew that burden all too well. Faces of his own squad flickered through his memory. Good men in Clear's throat. Women who had followed him into an ambush. Their deaths had been his fault. Whatever the official report said, Cale's expression hardened. So not just escaped slaves, valuable ones. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you immediately, Era said, but would you have helped us if I had? The question hung in the air. Unanswered, Kyle moved to the communications console and began working on the damaged circuits. What are you doing? Era asked, approaching cautiously, trying to call for help. Cale replied, not looking up from his work. If I can get this transmitter functioning, maybe we can reach a colonial patrol. For hours Cale worked on the communications array while Elra tended to her children. The younger one, Lee, had developed a worryingly her small body struggling with the planet's atmospheric composition. She needs medical attention, said as dawn broke, casting long shadows across the outpost floor. This atmosphere is too harsh for her. Kyle looked up from his futile repair efforts. The transmitter was beyond his ability to fix with the parts available. They were on their own. There's an abandoned research outpost about 20 km east, he said after a moment's thought. Might have medical supplies. You do that for us, Elra asked, surprise evident in her voice. Cale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to a storage locker and began pulling out gear, a backpack, a portable air filtration unit, emergency rations. We'll leave at dusk, he said finally. Less chance of being spotted. As the day wore on, Lee's condition deteriorated. Her breathing became more labored, her blue skin taking on a grayish tint. Siren sat by his sister's side, holding her hand and whispering stories of their home world, a place of crystal spires and endless skies that the young girl had never seen. What was it like? Kyle asked, surprising himself with the question. Your world. Siren looked up momentarily, startled out of his worry. I only know from stories. I was born in the mines. I've never seen it either. Added softly, my parents were taken when they were young, but my grandmother told me stories. Her voice took on a distant quality. She said the crystal forest would sing when the three moons aligned, and the great ocean would glow with life. During the dark season, there were flying creatures that would carry children on their backs during the Festival of Winds. Sounds beautiful, Kyle said. It was replied, and it will be again if we can keep Siren safe. Boy looked down, the burden of expectation visible in the slump of his shoulders. Cale felt a sudden urge to tell the kid it wasn't his fault, that no child should carry the hopes of an entire people, but who was he to talk? He couldn't even save his own squad. Kyle watched them from across the room as he prepared for their journey. Something about the boy's quiet strength reminded him of comrades long gone, men and women who had fought and died under his command during the border wars. One, in particular, James, the youngest member of his squad, barely 22, who had held off 3 enemy combatants while Cale dragged the wounded to safety. James had died still firing, still believing his sacrifice would save the others. It hadn't. They died anyway, one by one, as the enemy overran their position when the twin suns of Helios 9 finally sank below the horizon. Kyle and Elra prepared to depart. He handed her a pulse pistol, showing her how to charge and fire it. Stay close to me, he instructed. If we get separated, head east and follow the ridge line. You'll see the research outpost eventually. What about the children? Ira asked, looking back at Siren and Lee, who were bundled in thermal blankets. I've sealed the outpost as best I can, Cal replied. They should be safe until we return. Siren stepped forward, his young face set with determination. I should come with you. I can help. Cal knelt down to the boy's level. I need you here. Protecting your sister, that's the most important job right now. Can you do that? The boy nodded solemnly, his hand moving to the small knife Kale had given him earlier. I won't let anything happen to her. I know you won't, Kale said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. You're a warrior, Siren, just like your mother. The boy stood a little straighter at that, a flicker of pride crossing his face. Cal realized it might be the first time anyone had seen him as something other than a symbol or a tool. Just a brave kid trying to protect his family. Outside the landscape of Helios 9 stretched before them, bathed in the pale light of 3 moons. Jagged rock formations rose like the spines of ancient beasts, casting long shadows across the barren plains. The air was thin and cold, carrying the metallic taste of mineral dust. Kyle led the way, his experienced eyes scanning for signs of shock activity. Elra moved silently beside him, her natural bioluminescence dimmed to avoid detection. Can all your people do that? Kyle asked quietly, gesturing to her skin. Control the light? Yes, she replied. It evolved as a way to communicate in the deep caves of our world. The chakrals find it decorative. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. They force brighter illumination in the minds, even when it causes us pain. Kyle's disgust for the shock rolls deepened. In his years on the frontier, he'd encountered many species, some hostile, some peaceful, but few matched the shock rolls for deliberate cruelty. They had covered perhaps 5 kilometers when the first signs of trouble appeared. Fresh tracks in the dust, the distinctive 3-toed prints of Chakral scouts. There, patrolling the area, Kel whispered, crouching to examine the tracks. Recent, within the last hour. A distant howl echoed across the plains, answered by another from a different direction. The hunting call of shock rolls. They're coordinating, Cal said, grimly, rising to his feet. We need to move faster. The terrain grew more treacherous as they continued east, the ground broken by deep creases and fields of razor-sharp rock formations. Metallic dust began to fall, the beginnings of one of Helios 9's notorious acid storms. Cover your face, Kale ordered, pulling a protective mask from his pack and handing it to Era. He donned his own as the dust thickened, stinging any exposed skin. Through the worsening storm, they pushed on, the visibility dropping to mere meters. Howling wind masked their movements, but also obscured any approaching danger. Twice they nearly stumbled into deep fissures hidden by the swirling dust. Stay close, Cal shouted over the roar of the storm, reaching back to grip AR's hand. Her fingers were cold but strong, clinging to his as they navigated the treacherous landscape. The storm intensified, the acidic dust now burning through their clothing where it settled. Cal could feel it eating into his skin, each breath a struggle even through the Mask beside him, Era stumbled, her strength failing after days of running. And hunger we can't stop, Kale urged. Supporting her weight, the storm will kill us if we stop moving, I don't think. I can, Era began, but her words were cut off as the ground beneath her gave way. She fell, dragging Kale with her as a section of the path collapsed into a hidden crease. They tumbled down a slope of loose stones, Kale wrapping his body around Elira to shield her from the worst impacts. They came to rest on a narrow ledge, perhaps 15 ft below the path, bruised and battered but alive. Kyle groaned, disentangling himself from Elra. Are you hurt? I don't think so, she replied, her voice trembling. Just shaken. Above them, the storm raged on, but the overhanging rock provided some shelter. Cal examined their surroundings, his hand dropping to his knife as a sound caught his attention, a rhythmic scraping from deeper in the crease. We're not alone down here, he whispered, positioning himself in front of Era. From the darkness emerged a creature unlike any Kale had seen before, a writhing mass of tentacles surrounding a central body with multiple glowing eyes. It moved with surprising speed for its bulk, each tentacle ending in a barbed stinger that dripped with viscous fluid. Cave crawler, Ella breathed, venomous. The creature paused, its many eyes blinking in sequence as it assessed them. Then it charged, tentacles lashing forward. Cal met its attack with his knife, slicing through the first tentacle that reached for them. A high-pitched keening erupted from the creature as a yellowish fluid spurted from the severed appendage. Stench was overwhelming, like rotting meat and sulfur. More tentacles whipped toward them. Kale cut and stabbed, trying to keep the barbed stingers away from Elra, but there were too many. One slipped past his guard, wrapping around his leg. Pain seared through him as the barbs penetrated his clothing and sank into his flesh. Era fired the pulse pistol, the energy blast catching the creature in what might have been its face. It recoiled, releasing Kale, who collapsed to one knee, his leg already growing numb from the venom. We need to climb out, he gasped, fighting against the spreading paralysis. Now helped him to his feet, supporting him as they scrambled up the slope of loose stones. The creature recovered quickly, pursuing them with surprising agility. Tentacle wrapped around ankle, pulling her back down. She cried out, losing her grip on Kale, who barely managed to catch hold of an outcropping to prevent himself from falling as well. Era, he shouted, watching in horror as she was dragged toward the waiting stingers. With desperate strength, Elijah twisted in the creature's grip, bringing the pulse pistol to bear at point blank range. She fired repeatedly, each blast tearing through the creature's body until it finally released her, retreating into the darkness with a sound like tearing metal. Kel reached down, catching a hand as she climbed back up to him. Together they crawled over the edge of the crease and back onto the path, both gasping for breath. The venom, Eiley said, looking at Kale's leg with concern. How bad is it? Bad enough, Kale admitted, the numbness now spreading up past his knee. But we keep moving. We have to reach that outpost. After what seemed like hours, the silhouette of the abandoned research outpost finally emerged from the storm, a low dome-shaped structure, partially buried in the side of a cliff. Its exterior was corroded by years of exposure to the harsh elements, but the main airlock remained intact. Kyle approached cautiously, weapon ready, his injured leg dragging slightly. Stay. Behind me, he murmured to Era as he worked the manual override for the airlock with a groan of protesting. Metal, the door slid open, revealing darkness beyond. The interior of the outpost was cold and still, the air stale but breathable. Kel activated a light stick, illuminating a scene of hasty abandonment, overturned furniture, scattered equipment, and more ominously, dark stains on the floor that could only be blood. What happened here, Ara? Whispered, her voice tight. Research team probably ran into trouble, Kyle replied, moving deeper into the facility. Shock rolls maybe, or something else. This planet has its own dangers. They moved through the abandoned rooms, searching for the medical bay. Most of the equipment had been stripped or destroyed, but in a sealed cabinet, Kale discovered a cache of emergency medical supplies, including broad-spectrum antibiotics and respiratory aids designed for non-human physiology. Will these help Lee? He asked, showing the medications to Era. She examined the labels carefully. Yes, these could stabilize her until we can find a proper healer. Kyle winced as he sat down heavily on an overturned crate, the venom's effects becoming harder to ignore. Era noticed, kneeling beside him to examine the wound on his leg. The barbs are still embedded, she said grimly. They need to come out or they'll continue releasing venom. Kale nodded, gritting his teeth. Do it. Era worked with gentle efficiency, using tweezers from the medical supplies to extract the barbs one by one. Each removal sent fresh waves of pain through Kale and LT Unk and GT's leg, but he remained silent, focusing on his breathing as he clears throat, had been trained to do during field operations. You've done this before, he observed as she applied a numbing agent to the wounds. I was a healer before the chakrals came, she replied softly. My grandmother taught me the old ways, using plants and minerals from our world. The shock rolls found other uses for my skills. They made me tend to their wounded after battles, force-feeding our people stimulants to keep them working past exhaustion. In the mind, the bitterness in her voice was palpable, but beneath it was a deeper sorrow, the grief of someone who had seen their sacred calling perverted into a tool of oppression. How did you manage it? Kyle asked. Keep going, I mean, in the camps. Hands paused in their work. Children, she said simply. They needed someone to care for them, to remind them they were more than slaves, and each one I saved was a small victory against the shocks. She resumed, bandaging his leg. What about you? What keeps you going? Alone on this forsaken rock, Kel was silent for a long moment. Nothing noble, he finally said, just survival habit. Maybe. I don't believe that, Ella replied, meeting his gaze. No one survives on habit alone, clears throat. Before Kale could respond, a crash echoed from the front of the outpost. He motioned for silence, extinguishing the light stick and drawing his weapon. Moving silently to the doorway, he peered into the darkness of the main corridor. A massive chakral warrior stood in the open airlock, its yellow eyes scanning the interior. Behind it, two more figures were visible, weapons drawn. They tracked us through the storm, Kel whispered, his mind racing. There's another exit through the maintenance tunnels. We need to move now. They retreated deeper into the outpost, navigating by touch through pitch-black corridors. Behind them, the guttural commands of the shock rolls echoed, followed by the systematic destruction of doors and equipment as they searched. The maintenance tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, barely wide enough for a human to crawl through. For Elra, with her taller, more slender frame, it was an even tighter fit. Go, Cal urged, helping her into the tunnel. I'll hold them off and follow. No, protested. We go together or not at all. A roar of triumph echoed from nearby. They had been discovered. Cal made his decision, shoving the medical supplies into Era's arms and pushing her into the tunnel. Your children need these medicines, he said firmly. They need their mother. Go. Before she could protest further, Cal sealed the tunnel entrance and turned to face the approaching shocks. He positioned himself at a junction of corridors, using the corner for cover. The first chakral rounded the corner at a run, its massive form filling the narrow space. Cal fired twice, striking it in the chest. The creature stumbled, but didn't fall, its tough hide absorbing much of the energy blast. It roared in pain and rage, charging forward with surprising speed. Cal ducked under a sweeping blow from its clawed hand and drove his combat knife deep into the creature's side, finding the gap in its natural armor. Hot, viscous blood sprayed as he twisted the blade and pulled it free. The shock collapsed, gurgling its last breath. Two more appeared, advancing more cautiously. Now Cal retreated, firing to keep them at bay as he sought a defensible position. His back hit a sealed door. Dead end. The chakrals, sensing his predicament, spread out to block any escape. The larger of the two spoke, its voice a rumbling growl that somehow formed words. Where is the boy? Kyle raised his weapon. What boy? The chakral's yellow eyes narrowed. The Azirian child, the one who can awaken the old machines. Don't know what you're talking about, Kyle replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. The creature's mouth stretched in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of pointed teeth. Then you are of no use to us human. Both shock rolls charged simultaneously. Kyle fired, catching one in the throat. It fell thrashing. Second reached him before he could adjust his aim, knocking the weapon from his hand with a powerful blow. Massive claws ran across Cal's chest, tearing through his jacket and drawing blood. He staggered back, pain lancing through him. The shock pressed its advantage, pinning him against the wall with one hand while the other reached for a blade at its belt. With his free hand, Cal pulled a concealed knife from his boot and drove it upward under the creature's jaw. The shock released him, stumbling backward as it clawed at the blade. Embedded in its skull, it collapsed. Twitching, Kyle slumped against the wall, pressing a hand to his bleeding chest. The wounds were deep but had missed anything vital. He retrieved his weapon and made his way back to the maintenance tunnel, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his body. The tunnel seemed longer on the return journey, his injuries making the crawl agonizing. By the time he emerged on the other side, the acid storm had intensified, the air itself becoming caustic. Era was waiting, her face tight with worry. You're hurt, she said, moving to support him as he stumbled. We need to get back to the outpost, Kyle grunted, the taste of blood in his mouth. More will come. The return journey was a blur of pain and determination. Cal focused on putting one foot in front of the other, guided by Era through the worst of the storm. By the time they reached the outpost, dawn was breaking, the storm finally dissipating. Siren opened the Door at their approach, his young face showing relief that quickly turned to alarm at the sight of Kale's injuries. Behind him, Lee sat huddled in blankets, her breathing still labored, but her eyes alert. What happened, Siren asked as they stumbled inside. Shackles replied, helping Cal to a chair. They found us at the research facility, while Era administered the medicine too. Lee, Siren helped clean and bandage Kale and LT Unk and GT's wounds. The boy worked with surprising skill, his small hands steady. Where did you learn to do this? Kyle asked through gritted teeth, as Siren applied a disinfectant that burned like fire. In the mines, the boy replied quietly. Many were injured. Few were treated. Something in the boy's tone, the matter-of-fact acceptance of cruelty, struck Kale deeply. He had seen too many children robbed of their childhood by war and oppression. This boy deserved better. You're good at it, Kale said, healing like your mother. A flicker of pride crossed Siren's face. She taught me when the guards weren't watching, said Nala. Was the one thing they couldn't take from us. Smart woman, your mother, Kale replied, glancing over to where Elra sat, with Lee gently coaxing the girl to take the medicine. She is, Siren agreed, his voice dropping to a whisper. But she's tired, I can see it. Even when she tries to hide it, she hasn't slept properly since we escaped. Cal studied the boy's face, so young yet with eyes that had seen too much. It's not your job to worry about her. You know you're allowed to be a kid. Siren shook his head. Not anymore, not until our people are free. And how exactly are you planning to free them? Kyle asked, genuinely curious. Siren hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crystal shard. It glowed faintly in his palm, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. With this, it's a key to the old temples. The elders gave it to me before we escaped. They said I'm the only one who can use it. Cal looked at the crystal skeptically. And what do these temples do exactly? I don't know, Siren admitted. The elders said I'd understand when the time came. He closed his hand around the crystal, extinguishing its light. But sometimes I dream about them. Huge chambers filled with light and voices speaking in the old language. Before Kale could respond, Lee's voice called out from across the room. Siren, look. The girl was sitting up straighter, her breathing noticeably easier. The medicine was working, bringing color back to her blue cheeks. By midday, Lee's condition had improved dramatically, the medicine doing its work. She slept peacefully now, her small chest rising and falling in a regular rhythm. Aira sat by her side, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Kale checked the perimeter sensors, again finding no immediate signs of chakra activity, but he knew it was only a matter of time. They had to move. There's an old temple, I said suddenly, breaking the silence. About a day's journey south, built by my ancestors centuries ago. It's said to be protected. Kyle turned to her, skepticism clear on his face. Protected? How? The walls are lined with crystals that resonate with Azerian biology, she explained. They create barriers that non-Asurans cannot cross. Sounds like a fairy tale, Kel said. Elira's luminescent eyes met his. Many things in this universe seem like fairy tales until you witness them yourself. Siren approached the crystal shard now hanging from a cord around his neck. Temple in my dream, he said. It's real. Yes, replied. Your grandmother took me there once when I was very young. Before The Shocks found our settlement. It's one of the few places they've never been able to breach. Before Cale could respond, the proximity alarm blared. Again, louder and more urgent than before. He moved to the monitor, his heart sinking at what he saw. Dozens of heat signatures approaching from multiple directions, not just scouts. This time a war party. They're here, he said grimly, and there are too many to fight off. Rose, her decision made. Then we go to the temple. Now they gathered what supplies they could carry. Cale, pushing aside the pain of his injuries to help, Siren carried his sister, who was still weak but alert enough to cling to his neck. Ira took Cale's spare rifle, handling it with unexpected familiarity. I wasn't always a mine worker, she said, in response to his questioning look. Before the shock rolls came, I was a guardian of my people's sacred sites. They slipped out through a maintenance hatch at the rear of the outpost just as the first chakrals reached the main entrance. The sound of metal being torn apart followed them as they fled south toward the distant mountains where Elra claimed the temple waited. The landscape changed as they moved south, the barren plains giving way to rocky foothills. Vegetation appeared, hardy, thorny plants that clung to life in the harsh environment. Cale recognized some of them from his survival training, pointing out which ones contained water or had medicinal properties. This one, he said, stopping briefly to break off a piece of a succulent plant with purple spines. The flesh inside can help with infection. He demonstrated, squeezing the thick stem until a clear gel oozed out, then applied it to a scratch on Lee's arm where she had brushed against a sharp rock. The girl watched with fascination as the gel formed a protective film over the cut. It tingles, she said, the first words Cale had heard her speak directly to him. That means it's working, he replied with a smile. Your planet probably had plants like these too. We had healing gardens, said her voice wistful. Every settlement maintained one. The plants were sensitive to emotion. They would bloom more vibrantly when tended by someone with a kind heart. They traveled through the heat of the day, pushing themselves to cover as much ground as possible. Before the shock rolls realized they had fled, Lee grew stronger with each passing hour. The medicines from the research outpost countering the effects of the alien atmosphere. By late afternoon, they had reached a series of narrow canyons that wound through the foothills. Ara led them confidently, following markers visible only to her, slight discolorations in the rock that glowed faintly to her Azirian vision. How much farther? Kyle asked as they paused to rest in the shadow of a towering rock formation. We should reach the temple by nightfall, Era replied, helping Lee drink from their dwindling water supply. A sound echoed through the canyon, a distant howl that raised the hair on the back of Cale and LT Unk and GT's neck. The hunting call of chakrals. They've picked up our trail, he said, rising to his feet despite the protest of his injured body. We need to move faster. The canyons narrowed further, forcing them to proceed in single file. Cale took the lead, his weapon ready, while Elra brought up the rear, constantly glancing behind them. Siren carried Lee in the middle, the young girl now able to walk short distances, but still too weak for the difficult terrain. The howls grew closer, echoing confusingly off the canyon walls. It was impossible to tell how many pursuers there were or exactly where they were coming from. As they rounded a bend, Cale halted abruptly, raising a hand. Warning, ahead the canyon widened into a small clearing, and standing in the center was a shock scout, its back to them as it examined the ground. Kyle motioned for the others to stay put as he crept forward, knife in hand. The shock roll was focused on the tracks they had left, unaware of his approach. With practiced precision, Kyle struck, driving his blade into the base of the creature's skull where the armored hide was thinnest. It died without a sound, collapsing into his arms as he lowered it quietly to the ground. There will be others nearby, he whispered as Elra and the children caught up. They never scout alone, they continued with increased caution, every clear's throat. Sense alert for danger, the canyons began to rise, the path growing steeper as they ascended into the mountains. Proper, the air thinned further, making breathing laborious, especially for Lee, who began to struggle again. Despite the medicine, as they climbed, Kale noticed something strange about the rock walls around them. Veins of crystals similar to the shard siren, carried running through the stone like frozen rivers of light. They grew more numerous as the path continued upward, some large enough to cast a soft glow that illuminated their way as daylight faded. The temple is close, Elra said, her voice hushed. These are the paths of remembrance. Our ancestors carved them to guide pilgrims to the sacred site. The crystals pulsed with increasing brightness as they continued responding to the Azirian's presence. Sirens. Crystal shard glowed in harmony, its light intensifying until it shone like a small star against his chest. Just as the last light of day was fading, they emerged from the canyon network onto plateau, and there, carved into the face of the mountain before them, was the temple had spoken of. Ancient pillars framed an entrance large enough to admit a small ship. The stone worked with such precision that even after centuries of exposure, the seams were barely visible. We made it, breathed, relief washing over her face. Lee gasped in wonder, her eyes wide. It's just like in your stories, Mother. As they approached the temple entrance, Kyle noticed strain. Symbols carved into the stone, flowing organic patterns that seemed to shift in the fading light. They triggered a distant memory from his military days. Briefings about ancient civilizations discovered on the frontier worlds. Your people built this, he asked, running a hand over the intricate carvings. Nodded. Long before the Chakras came, when we were still travelers among the stars. Siren stepped forward, the crystal around his neck now pulsing in rhythm with the larger formations embedded in the temple walls. He reached out, placing his hand on a circular indentation in the center of the main door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a deep inhalation, the massive stone doors began to slide apart, revealing darkness beyond. How did you know to do that? Era asked her son, surprise evident in her voice. I saw it, Siren replied. Simply, in my dreams. Inside, the temple opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness above. Walls were embedded with crystalline formations that emitted a soft blue white light, illuminating the space with a gentle glow. The air was noticeably easier to breathe, somehow cleaner than the harsh atmosphere outside. The temple maintains its own environment, explained, seeing Kale's surprise. It was designed as a sanctuary. They move deeper into the temple, passing through chambers of increasing grandeur. In the central hall, a massive crystal Formation rose from the floor, reaching toward the vatted ceiling. Unlike the others, this crystal remained dark. Dormant. Lee's condition improved dramatically once inside the temple. She wiggled down from her brother's arms, walking with growing confidence as she explored the ancient space. Her natural bioluminescence brightened in response to the crystal energies around them, her small form casting dancing shadows on the walls. Why did your people abandon this place? Kyle asked, his tactical mind already assessing defensible positions. They didn't abandon it, willingly replied, her voice soft with old sorrow. The shock rolls came in overwhelming numbers. Those who survived were taken as slaves. As Elra spoke, Kale noticed symbols appearing on the walls around them, glowing sigils that formed and faded like writing on water. What's happening? The temple remembers, Era whispered. It's showing us its history. The symbols coalesced into images, scenes of Azirians in flowing robes performing rituals around the central crystal, which blazed with light. In the vision, the images shifted to show chakra breaching the temple entrance, the crystal's light failing as Azirians fell or fled before the attackers. The temple fell because there was no one left to maintain its connection. I explained, the crystals need Azirian energy to function at full capacity. Siren approached the central crystal, drawn to it as if by an invisible force. He reached out a hand, his small fingers hovering just above its surface. Siren wait began, but it was too late. As the boy's hand made contact with the crystal, it flared to life, illuminating the chamber with brilliant blue light. The other crystals responded, their glow intensifying until the entire temple shone like a beacon. What's happening? Cal demanded, shielding his eyes from the sudden brightness. The temple recognizes him, Era whispered, awe in her voice. It's accepting him as a true descendant. Siren stood transfixed, his hand fused to the crystal surface. His eyes were wide but unseeing, filled with the same blue light that emanated from the crystal. His body trembled with the force of the energy flowing through him. Is this hurting him? Kale asked, urgently moving toward the boy. No, Era replied, though uncertainty tinged her voice. It's overwhelming but not harmful. The temple is sharing its knowledge with him, just as it did with our ancestors. The ground trembled beneath their feet as ancient mechanisms awakened from the walls. Sections of stone slid away, revealing hidden chambers and passageways, and more concerning to Kale. The main entrance through which they had entered began to close, massive stone doors sliding together with the inexorable force of mountains moving. Are we being sealed in? He asked, moving toward the entrance. Protected. Corrected. The temple is activating its defenses. Outside, a chorus of shock howls rose in alarm. They had seen the temple awakening through the narrowing gap of the closing doors. Kale caught glimpses of scaled figures rushing toward the entrance, weapons raised. First shock rolls reached the doors just as they sealed shut, the sound of their impacts reverberating through the stone like distant thunder. Then silence fell, broken only by the soft hum of energy from the awakened crystals. Will those doors hold? Kyle asked, still tense, expecting an attack at any moment. They've held for centuries, Era replied. But the chakrals are persistent, and they have weapons that our ancestors never anticipated. As if in confirmation of her fears, a booming Impact shook the temple, dust raining. Down from the ceiling, the shock rolls had brought heavier weapons to bear. Siren finally broke contact with the central crystal, staggering backward. Into his mother's arms, his eyes gradually returned to normal, the blue glow fading. "What did you see?" Alir asked gently, supporting her exhausted son. "Everything," the boy whispered, his voice distant. "Our history, our purpose." The temple was built as more than a sanctuary. It was a beacon meant to call our scattered people home. He looked up at his mother, tears streaming down his face. "There are others, mother, other survivors hidden across the stars. The temple can reach them." Elra's eyes widened. "You're certain?" Siren nodded. "But the beacon needs power, more than I can provide alone." Another impact rocked the temple stronger than before. Small fragments of stone fell from the ceiling. "They're getting through," Cal said grimly. "We need to prepare, find defensible positions, inventory our weapons and supplies." While Elra tended to the children, Kale explored the newly revealed chambers of the temple. One contained what appeared to be sleeping quarters with stone platforms covered in a moss-like growth that was surprisingly comfortable. Another held a pool of clear water fed by an underground spring. Most interesting to Kale was a chamber that contained weapons. Not energy weapons or advanced technology, but finely crafted blades, spears, and bows made from materials he didn't recognize. He selected a bow and a quiver of arrows, testing the draw. Despite its apparent age, the weapon was perfectly preserved, the string taut and responsive. The arrows were unlike any he had seen before, their shafts made of a crystalline material similar to the formations in the temple walls, the tips glowing faintly with stored energy. He ran a finger along one, feeling Clear's throat, a slight vibration, as if the arrow itself were alive. He returned to the main chamber to find Siren still communing with the central crystal, his small face illuminated by its glow. The boy seemed transfixed, unaware of his surroundings. "What's happening to him?" Kale asked. Concerned, "He's connecting with the knowledge stored in the crystal," she explained. "The history of our people, the secrets of the temple. It's a lot for someone so young to absorb." Another impact rocked the temple. Stronger than before, small fragments of stone fell from the ceiling. "There. Getting through," Kale said grimly. "Not yet," Era replied, moving to stand beside her son. "Siren, we need the shields now." The boy didn't respond verbally, but the crystal beneath his hand pulsed brighter. A wave of energy rippled outward from the central chamber, racing through the temple and into the walls. The crystals embedded in the stone brightened further, and a low, resonant tone filled the air. Outside, the impact ceased, replaced by distant, frustrated howls. "What just happened?" Kyle asked. "The temple's main defense," said, pride evident in her voice. "Barrier that repels anyone with harmful intent, and your son activated it with my guidance." She nodded. "He's young, but his connection to the crystals is stronger than any I've seen in generations." Lee approached her brother, reaching up to touch his arm. At her contact, Siren blinked, coming out of his trance-like state. He looked disoriented for a moment before focusing on his sister's face. "I saw them," he said softly. "Our ancestors, they showed me things." Before he could elaborate, a new sound reached them, a high-pitched whine that set Kale's teeth on edge. It rose in intensity until the very air seemed to vibrate. They're using sonic disruptors, Kyle realized with alarm. Militar Rigra, designed to destabilize structures. The temple shuddered, more debris falling. From above, cracks appeared in the ancient stone, spreading like lightning. Across the ceiling, the barrier can't stop sound waves, said fear in her voice. If they collapse, the temple can we amplify the barrier? Kale asked. Make it stronger. Siren looked up, his expression thoughtful despite his exhaustion. Maybe if we had more power. How do we get more power? Kale pressed. The temple was designed to draw energy from multiple Azirians, the boy explained. A circle of guardians, all connected to the central crystal. But there are only two of you, Kale said, looking between Elra and Siren. 3. Lee corrected, stepping forward. I can help too. No, protested. You're too young, too weak from your illness. I'm stronger now, Lee insisted, and the temple makes me feel better, as if to prove her point. Her natural bioluminescence brightened, her blue skin glowing with renewed vitality. Another more violent tremor shook the temple. A large section of ceiling collapsed in one of the outer chambers, the crash echoing through the ancient halls. We're out of options, Kale said grimly, and out of time. Hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but we do this together. Siren directed them to positions around the central crystal. Elra and Lee standing at points equidistant from each other, forming a triangle with him at the center. The crystal towered above them, its light pulsing in time with their heartbeats. Now what? Kyle asked, standing back. Bow ready, feeling useless in this battle of energies he barely understood. Now we connect, Siren replied, all at once. The 3 Azirians reached out simultaneously, their hands touching the crystal surface. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The crystal's glow intensified tenfold, bathing the chamber in blinding blue light. The energy spread outward in a visible wave, reinforcing the temple's structure as it passed. The sonic attack continued, but now the temple stood firm, the cracks in the stone sealing themselves as the crystal energy flowed through them. Kale watched in amazement as the 3 Azirians maintained their connection, their bodies rigid with concentration. Aira's face was set in determination, Siren's in deep focus, and young Lee's in an expression of wonder and joy. But the strain was visible too. Sweat beaded on Aira's forehead, and Siren's hand trembled against the crystal. Lee, despite her earlier confidence, was the first to show signs of weakening, her small frame swaying as the connection drained her strength. They can't keep this up indefinitely, Cal realized. I need to take the fight to them, surprise them before they bring this whole place down. He made a swift decision. Is there another way out of here? He called to a way to reach the shack rolls without breaking your connection. She nodded toward one of the newly revealed passages. The summit path, she gasped, her voice strained by the effort of maintaining the energy flow. It leads to an observation platform. Hold on as long as you can, Kyle told her, already moving toward the indicated passage. I'll do what I can to stop them. The path led upward through a series of winding corridors and narrow stairways carved into the living rock. The climb was arduous, especially with his injuries, but Kyle pushed through the pain, driven by the knowledge that 3 lives depended on his success. Finally, he emerged onto a high platform overlooking the plateau where they had entered the temple. Below, in the light of portable illuminators, a group of Shock rolls operated a large device. Aimed at the temple entrance, the sonic disruptor, around them at least 20 more. Warriors stood guard or prepared other equipment. Among them Kel spotted a particularly large chakral adorned with trophies of bone and metal, including what appeared to be blue fingers strung into a grotesque necklace. The leader, he guessed, directing the assault with confident gestures. Kyle assessed the situation with a veteran's eye. The chakrals were focused on the main entrance, unaware of the observation platform above, with the element of surprise and the strange crystalline arrows he had found. He might be able to take out the disruptor before the temple suffered catastrophic damage. He knocked one of the glowing arrows, drawing the string back to his cheek as he sighted along the shaft. His first target was the disruptor's power source, a glowing module on its side. Cal released his breath slowly and let the arrow fly. It streaked through the air, its crystalline shaft leaving a trail of blue light. When it struck the power module, the effect was far more dramatic than he had anticipated. The arrow detonated on impact, releasing a surge of energy that completely destroyed the disruptor. In a blinding flash, the chakrals scattered. In confusion, several knocked off their feet by the blast. Their leader bellowed orders, pointing toward the observation platform where Kale stood. He had lost the element of surprise, but now had their full attention, exactly as he had intended. Kale loosed arrow after arrow, each finding its mark with devastating effect. The crystalline weapons were far more powerful than he had expected, tearing through shock armor that would have resisted conventional projectiles. But they quickly recovered from their initial shock, returning fire with energy weapons that blasted chunks from the stone around him. Cal was forced to take cover, ducking behind a decorative pillar as energy bolts scorched the air. Where he had stood, below, the chakra leader was organizing a group to scale the mountain and reach the observation platform. Cal counted at least 10 warriors beginning to climb, with more covering their advance with suppressing fire. Inside the temple, he knew Era and her children couldn't maintain their connection to the crystal indefinitely. He needed to end this quickly. Drawing his last 3 arrows, Kale made a desperate plan. He waited until the climbing chakras had reached the steepest part of their ascent, where they would be most vulnerable. Then he rose from cover, ignoring the energy bolts that sizzled past him, and fired. In rapid succession, the first arrow struck the rock face just below the lead climbers, triggering a small avalanche that swept 3 chakras from the mountain. The second caught a cluster of warriors as they bunched together at a narrow ledge, the explosion sending them plummeting to the plateau below. The third arrow Kale aimed directly at the chakral leader, who stood shouting orders from the relative safety of the plateau. The arrow flew true, but at the last moment the leader sensed the danger and dodged. The arrow struck the ground at his feet, the explosion throwing him backward but not killing him. Cal had expected to feel satisfaction at striking such a blow against the creatures who had enslaved Era's people. Instead, he felt only a grim determination to protect the 3 beings who had somehow become important to him. In Clear's throat, the short time he had known them, his quiver empty, Cal prepared to defend the platform with his knife. But before the remaining chakrals could reach him, the temple itself seemed to respond to the threat. The crystals embedded in the observation Platform began to glow with increasing intensity. Energy crackled along the stone, coalescing into a swirling vortex of blue light that rose from the center of the platform. It shot skyward in a brilliant beam, piercing the night with its radiance. Inside the temple, Era, Siren, and Lee had managed to synchronize their energies completely, achieving what generations of their ancestors had only dreamed of. The temple's full power was awakened, its ancient systems responding to their combined will. The energy beam split into multiple strands, each targeting a different chakra position. Where they struck, the ground erupted in explosions of crystalline shards and blinding light. The shock rolls scattered many, dropping their weapons as they fled into the canyons. Their leader stood his ground longer than the others, his yellow eyes fixed on the temple with a hatred so intense it was almost palpable, but even he was forced to retreat as the ground beneath his feet began to crystallize. The transformation creeping up his legs like rapidly growing ice. With a final roar of defiance, he broke free and limped away, leaving pieces of his armored hide embedded in the crystallized ground. The display of power was awe-inspiring but brief. The energy beam flickered and died, the crystals dimming as the temple's reserves were depleted. Inside, Kale knew Aya and her children would be at the limits of their endurance. He hurried back down the winding path, ignoring the pain of his own injuries. When he reached the central chamber, he found all three Azirians collapsed around the now darkened crystal. Their natural bioluminescence dimmed to almost nothing. Kale rushed to them, checking for signs of life. Aira stirred at his touch, her eyes opening slowly. "Did it work?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It worked," Cal assured her. "The chakrals are gone. You did it." She smiled weakly, then her eyes widened in alarm. "The children, they're alive," Cal said, having confirmed that both Siren and Lee were breathing, though unconscious, just exhausted, I think. He helped Era to a sitting position, then carefully gathered Lee in his arms. The girl was light, her small body limp with exhaustion. Siren was too heavy for Elra to carry in her weakened state, so Kale returned for him after settling Lee and Era in the sleeping chamber he had discovered earlier. As he lifted the boy, Siren stirred, his eyes opening to mere slits. "Did we save the temple?" he murmured. "You did more than that," Kel replied softly. "You drove the chakrals away completely." A small smile touched the boy's lips before he drifted back into unconsciousness. The next hours were spent in recovery. Kale found food and water in the temple's hidden chambers, along with more of the healing moss that he used to treat their various injuries. By morning, all three Azirians were awake, though still weak. "Beacon," Siren said as soon as he was coherent enough to speak. "Did it activate?" There was a beam of light. Cal confirmed. It shot straight up into the sky. The boy nodded, satisfaction evident in his tired face. "Then it worked. The signal has been sent." "Signal to whom?" Kyle asked. "To other Azirians," explained, "scattered across the stars. When our home world fell, the temple was designed to call them home. How long will it take for them to receive it?" Kale asked to respond. "That depends on how far they've scattered," replied. "Days, weeks, perhaps longer, and the shocks." Kale pressed. "They'll be back, won't they?" "Eventually," Elra acknowledged, "but not immediately. Their leader Carax was injured. He'll need to regroup, gather more forces." Kale moved to the temple entrance, which had reopened now that the immediate threat had passed. From there he could see the plateau where the battle had taken place. The ground was transformed, patches of crystallized earth glittering in the morning sunlight of the chakras. There was no sign. We should use this time to strengthen our position, he said, thinking aloud. Temple has defenses, but they drained you to activate. We need alternatives. You're staying with us? Aura asked, surprised in something warmer in her voice. Kale turned to face her. You think I'd leave now after all this? She held his gaze for a long moment. Most humans would. Our battle is not yours. It became mine the moment you showed up at my door, Cal replied simply. Days that followed fell into a pattern. Mornings were spent exploring the temple, discovering its secrets with Siren's growing ability to interpret the ancient knowledge stored in the crystals. Afternoons were dedicated to fortifying their position, setting traps in the canyons, and establishing early warning systems for when the shock rolls inevitably returned. Evenings were quieter, spent around a small fire in the central chamber, sharing stories and slowly healing both physically and emotionally. Lee blossomed in the temple environment, her natural resilience finally allowed to shine. She took to following Kale everywhere, asking endless questions about Earth and human customs. Her innocent curiosity was a balm to his battle-car soul. Siren grew more confident as his understanding of the temple systems deepened. The burden of expectation he carried seemed lighter now that he had a concrete purpose and the means to fulfill it, and Arakyle found himself increasingly drawn to her quiet strength, her unwavering devotion to her children, her resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. They worked side by side during the days and in the evenings. Their conversations often continued long after the children had fallen asleep. It was during one such evening, a week after their arrival at the temple, that the proximity sensors Kale had established around the perimeter began to signal something was approaching. From the east, multiple somethings moving fast. Chakras asked, already moving to wake the children. Kyle studied the readings. No different signature, smaller, faster. They gathered at the temple entrance, weapons ready. Despite Kale and LT Unk and GT assessment, the first light of dawn was just breaking over the eastern horizon, illuminating a dust cloud approaching rapidly up the canyon path. Those aren't shocks, Era whispered, her keen eyes picking out details Kale couldn't yet see. As the figures drew closer, their features became clear, slender, blue-skinned beings moving with the fluid grace that characterized the Zarans, more than a dozen of them, dressed in a mixture of scavenged armor and traditional garments, carrying an assortment of weapons. The beacon worked. Siren breathed awe in his voice. They're coming home. The first wave of returning Azirians reached the temple by midday. Their leader, a battle-car female named Tease, embracing Elra like a long-lost sister. We felt the calling, Tease explained as they gathered in the central chamber, a pull that could not be ignored, drawing us here from across the sector. How many of you are there? Elira asked. Our band number's 37, Tease replied, but we've sent messages to other groups we've encountered over the years if they received the beacon as well. They did, Siren said with quiet certainty. The temple confirms other signals have been acknowledged. Tease regarded the boy with newfound respect. You're the one who activated the beacon. The temple keeper, Siren, straightened. Under her gaze, I just did what was needed. Cal watched the reunion from a slight distance, feeling both satisfied and somehow out of place. This was their victory, their moment of hope after generations of enslavement, his part in it seemed incidental, as if sensing his thoughts, broke away from the group and moved to stand beside him. You made this possible, she said softly. Without you, we would never have reached the temple. You would have found a way, Cal replied. You're resilient, perhaps, she acknowledged, but the fact remains you chose to help us when you could have turned us away. You fought for children, not your own, for a people not your species. She took his hand, her cool fingers intertwining with his. That makes you part of this, whether you feel it or not. Before he could respond, a commotion arose at the temple entrance. A wounded Azerian scout staggered in, supported by two companions, shackles. He gasped, a massive force moving up the southern canyon. Carax leads them. Peaceful reunion shattered into urgent preparations for battle. Tease organized her warriors with practiced efficiency, while Elra and Siren worked to ready the temple's defenses. Kale found himself the role of tactical advisor, his military experience suddenly valuable as they planned their defense. The Azerians listened attentively as he outlined positions, fallback points, and ambush locations they'll expect us to rely on. The temple's energy defenses, he explained, so we give them what they expect, a visible show of force at the main entrance. Meanwhile, small teams can strike from the observation platforms and hidden passages. Tease nodded in agreement. My warriors know how to move silently. We can inflict significant damage before they realize what's happening exactly, Kale said. Make them pay for every step. As the others dispersed to their assigned positions, Era approached Kale once more. You should take the children to the innermost chamber, she said. It's the most defensible position if they breach the temple. And you, Kale asked, though he already knew the answer. I'll be with the defenders at the main entrance, she replied. The temple needs Azerian energy to function at full capacity. Kyle wanted to argue, to insist she stay with her children, but he recognized the steel in her voice. This was her fight, perhaps more than anyone's. Instead, he simply nodded. Be careful, you too, she said, then hesitated before adding, if anything happens to me, it won't. Cal interrupted firmly, but if it does, she persisted, promise me you'll keep them safe, get them off this planet somewhere. The shock rolls can't follow. The weight of her request settled on Kale's shoulders, a trust so profound it left him momentarily speechless. Finally he nodded. I promise. The shock force arrived at dusk, their torches and illuminators creating a river of light that flowed up the canyon toward the temple. From his position on one of the lower observation platforms, Kale estimated their numbers at well over 100 warriors with heavy weapons, being dragged by beast-like creatures. At their head strode Carax, his massive form unmistakable even at a distance. One side of his face was scarred and partially crystallized from his encounter with the temple's energy, giving him an even more fearsome appearance. The Azerians waited in silence as the shocks approached, conserving their strength for the coming battle. The temple itself seemed to hold its breath, the crystals dimmed to avoid giving away positions. When the first Wave of shock rolls reached the plateau. Before the temple, Tees gave the signal. From multiple hidden positions, Azirian warriors unleashed a barrage of crystalline arrows and energy bolts. The front ranks of shock rolls fell in confusion, their disciplined advance dissolving into chaos. Kel targeted the heavy weapons first, his borrowed Azirian bow sending crystalline arrows. With deadly accuracy, 2 siege engines erupted in explosive chain reactions before the shocks could even position them, but the initial advantage of surprise couldn't last. The shocks regrouped quickly under Carax's bellowed commands, forming shield walls and returning fire with devastating effect. Several Azirian positions were hit. The defenders forced to fall back to secondary positions inside the temple. Elra and a circle of elders channeled energy into the defensive systems, creating a shimmering barrier across the main entrance. Shock energy bolts splashed harmlessly against it, but each impact drained the Azirians, maintaining the shield. Cal continued picking off targets from his elevated position until a group of shocks identified his location and concentrated their fire on him. Stone exploded around him as energy bolts tore into the platform. He was forced to retreat to the inner passages, joining a defensive team at a choke point. The battle raged for hours, neither side gaining a decisive advantage. The Azirians had the benefit of the temple's defenses in superior position, but the Chakrals had overwhelming numbers and seemed willing to accept horrific casualties to achieve their objective. As the night wore on, the temple's energy reserves began to wane. The defensive barrier flickered, allowing some shock roll projectiles to penetrate. One such bolt struck an elder, maintaining the shield, breaking the circle. The barrier collapsed entirely, leaving the main entrance vulnerable. Chakra warriors surged forward, only to be met by Talais and her best fighters in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The narrow entrance became a killing ground, bodies piling up as both sides fought with savage determination. Kel fought his way to the central chamber, knowing that if the entrance fell, the shock rolls would push straight for the heart of the temple and the children hidden there. He found Elra slumped against the central crystal, exhausted from channeling its energy for hours there. Breaking through, he told her, helping her to her feet. We need to fall back to the inner chambers. She nodded weakly, allowing him to support her as they retreated deeper into the temple. They passed wounded Azirians being tended by healers and warriors preparing last-ditch defensive positions. In the innermost chamber, they found Siren and Lee huddled with several other Azirian children. Siren rose at their approach, his young face set in determined lines. I can help, he insisted. The temple showed me something, a last resort. No, said firmly despite her exhaustion. Whatever it is, it's too dangerous. But Mother, no, she repeated. We and LT Unk and GT LL find another way. Before they could argue further, an explosion rocked the temple, much closer than the previous impacts. The shock rolls had breached the secondary defenses. We're out of time, Kyle said grimly, checking his weapons. And nearly out of options. The sounds of fighting grew louder, punctuated by the distinctive roars of shock rolls and the higher-pitched cries of wounded Azirians. The battle was moving steadily inward, the defenders being pushed back. Room by room, Talais appeared at the chamber entrance, blood streaming from a wound in her shoulder. Carax is leading them personally now, she reported. We can't hold them much longer, exchanged a look with her son, a silent communication passing between them. Siren nodded, his expression solemn. Beyond his years, there is one option. Left said, turning to Kale, but it requires sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Kale demanded. Instead of answering directly, Era knelt before her children, embracing them both tightly. Remember who you are, she whispered. Remember our people, our history, carry it forward. Alarmed, Kale grabbed her arm as she rose. What are you planning? The temple's final defense, she explained, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Purification wave that will destroy any hostile presence within its walls. At what cost? Kale pressed. The one who triggers it must remain at the central crystal, she said simply. To direct the energy, understanding dawned on Kale with sickening clarity. No, there has to be another way. There isn't, insisted. Not with the time we have left. Another explosion shook the temple closer, still. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Then, I'll do it, Kale said impulsively. Tell me how. Era shook her head. It requires Azirian biology. It has to be me. Mother, no, Lee cried, clinging to Era's legs. Don't leave us. Elira knelt again, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. I'll never truly leave you, she promised. I'll be part of the temple, watching over you always. Siren stood rigid, tears streaming silently down his face. There must be another way, he insisted, echoing Kale and LT Unk and GT earlier words. The temple showed you what must be done, R reminded him gently. You knew this might be necessary. The boy nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of inevitability. I'll help you prepare the ritual. No, Elra said firmly, you must lead our people now. Take your sister and the others to safety through the western passage. It leads to caves that connect with the far side of the mountain. Taylor stepped forward. I'll go with them, she offered. Ensure they reach safety. Clasped the warrior's forearm in gratitude. Thank you, sister. As the children were gathered and preparations made for their escape, Kale pulled aside. There has to be another way, he insisted again. Let me try to hold them off while you escape with the children. And how long would that last? She asked gently. Minutes, seconds. This way our people have a future. She placed a hand on his cheek. You gave us that chance when you took us in. Now I must ensure it wasn't for nothing. Before he could respond, she leaned forward and kissed him, a brief, tender gesture that conveyed everything words could not. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Keep your promise, she reminded him. Keep them safe. With that, she turned and strode purposefully toward the central chamber, her back straight despite her exhaustion. Kel watched her go, mixture of admiration and despair. Tightening his chest, Tail Eyes approached, leading the group of children. We need to move, she said quietly. The passage will be hard to defend if they discover it. Cal nodded numbly, his eyes still fixed on Elra's retreating form. Then he looked down at Siren and Lee, their faces tear-streaked but determined. He had made a promise. Let's go, he said, taking Lee's small hand in his own. Western Passage was narrow and winding, clearly designed as an emergency escape route. They moved as quickly as possible, the sounds of battle growing more distant behind them. The children were remarkably quiet, even the youngest seeming to understand the gravity of their situation. They had nearly reached the exit when the temple shuddered violently, a wave of energy passing through the stone around them. Crystals embedded in the walls flared briefly, then dimmed to darkness. Lee stopped, turning back toward the temple. "Mother," she whispered. Kyle lifted her into his arms, holding her close as she began to sob against his shoulder. Siren stood motionless, his face a mask of grief and resignation. "She succeeded," Taylor said softly, her hand on Siren's shoulder. "The temple is cleansed." They emerged from the passage into a small valley on the far side of the mountain, hidden from the plateau where the battle had raged. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. In silence they made their way down the valley, putting distance between themselves and the temple. No pursuit came. The purification wave had apparently been as thorough as Elra had promised. They made camp in a defensible position among the rocks, the exhausted children quickly falling asleep despite their grief. Cal kept watch, his mind replaying the events of the past days, searching for a point where things might have gone differently. Siren joined him after a time, sitting quietly at his side. "It's not your fault," the boy said. "Eventually she made her choice." Kyle glanced at him, surprised by the insight. "I should have found another way." "There wasn't one," Siren replied with the same certainty his mother had shown. "The temple's knowledge is clear on this: one life for many. It's the balance our ancestors built into its design." They sat in companionable silence as the sun rose higher, illuminating the valley in golden light. "What happens now?" Kale asked finally. "We rebuild," Siren said simply. "The temple will recover its energy over time. Other Assyrians will come, drawn by the beacon. Will create something new from the ashes of the old." "And you," Kyle pressed, "what will you do?" The boy considered this for a moment. "Learn, grow stronger, prepare for Carax's return." "You think he survived?" Siren nodded grimly. "I would have felt his passing. He escaped before Mother triggered the purification. Then we'll be ready for him," Kyle promised. Together, the boy looked up at him, hope kindling in his eyes. "You're staying with us?" "I made a promise to your mother," Cal replied, "to keep you safe. I intend to honor it." What he didn't say was that these children, and by extension their people, had somehow become important to him. After years of isolation, of nursing old wounds and hiding from painful memories, he had found a purpose again, a reason to fight, to build, to live. In the days that followed, more Assyrians arrived. Drawn by the beacon's call, they established a settlement in the valley, using materials from the surrounding area to construct dwellings and defenses. Kyle's military experience proved invaluable as they prepared for the inevitable return of the Shakrals. Siren spent much of his time at the temple, which had become accessible again as its energy slowly regenerated. He studied the ancient knowledge stored in its crystals, learning the history and technologies of his people. Lee attached herself firmly to Kyle, following him everywhere and gradually working her way past the defenses he had built around his heart. Her resilience in the face of loss reminded him of her mother, as did the quiet determination that occasionally showed through her childlike exterior. One evening, as they stood on a ridge overlooking the growing settlement, Lee tugged at Kale and LT Unk and GT hand. "Mother would be proud," she said. Softly of all of us, yes, Cal. Agreed, his throat tight with emotion. She would, Siren says she's still with us, the girl continued, in the temple. Crystals, he says her energy is part of them now. Kyle had no idea if this was true or simply the boy's way of coping with loss, but he nodded anyway. That sounds right. Do you think we'll ever go back to Earth? Lee asked, changing subjects with the mercurial nature of children, see where humans come from. Maybe someday, Cal replied, surprised by how appealing the idea suddenly seemed. Not the Earth he had left, a place of painful memories and ghosts, but a new Earth seen through the wonder-filled eyes of these children. I'd like that, Lee decided, leaning against his side. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Cal spotted a series of lights moving in formation, too regular to be natural, too numerous to be shock. Ships, colonial patrol, he realized aloud, recognizing the flight pattern. They must have detected the energy surge from the temple. Within the hour, the first colonial ships landed on the outskirts of the settlement. Armored figures emerged, weapons ready but not hostile. Kyle stepped forward to meet them, Siren and Lee at his sides. Patrol commander recognized him immediately. Lieutenant Kyle, we received a distress beacon from the sector weeks ago, but couldn't pinpoint the location until that energy surge lit up half the system. It's a long story, Commander Cal replied, glancing down at the children beside him. But I'm not alone anymore. The commander followed, his gaze, her expression softening slightly behind her visor. I can see that. She gestured to the settlement behind them. And you've been busy over the next hours. Kyle explained the situation to the colonial authorities, the Azerian refugees, the shock threat, the ancient temple with its powerful technology. The commander was particularly interested in the temple, ordering a team to investigate its potential strategic value. What happens now? Cale asked when the debriefing was complete. We've been authorized to offer protection to these refugees, the commander replied. The Colonial Council has been looking for ways to counter shock expansion in the sector. This settlement could be a valuable ally. And the children? Kyle pressed, his concern evident. The commander glanced at where Siren and Lee waited, their luminescent eyes reflecting the lights of the colonial ships. That depends, she said carefully. Do they have a guardian? Kyle straightened, his decision made long before this moment. Yes, he said firmly, they do. Commander nodded, satisfaction evident in her posture. Then I see no problem. We'll establish a permanent garrison here, provide supplies and equipment to strengthen the settlement as the colonial forces integrated with the Azerian settlement, setting up defensive perimeters and communication arrays. Cale found himself standing once more on the ridge overlooking the valley. This time, Siren and Lee stood on either side of him, all three watching the sun set on a day of new beginnings. Mother would say this was meant to be, Siren observed quietly, that all paths led to this moment. Do you believe that? Kyle asked. The boy considered for a moment. I believe we make our own destiny, he finally said, but sometimes the universe conspires to help us. Cale placed a hand on each child's shoulder, feeling a fierce protectiveness that he had thought lost with his old squad. These children were not replacements for those he had failed to save. They were something new, a second chance he had never expected. Whatever comes next, so He promised them, we face it together. In the valley below, Azirians and humans worked side by side, building something that had never existed before. Community of two species united by common purpose, and in the distance the ancient temple stood watch, its crystals beginning to glow once more as energy returned to its systems. Somewhere in that crystalline matrix, Kale-like too, think essence remained, watching over her children, witnessing the future she had sacrificed everything to secure. Not a bad legacy, he reflected, not bad at all. As night fell fully, the three of them made their way back to the settlement where lights glowed warmly against the darkness, and the promise of tomorrow awaited.